In Matunda, Dennis lived an ordinary life. He worked where work could be found. He walked the dusty roads between home and the market. Then one afternoon in October 2020, he made one last walk to the market. Police officers arrested him, took the man to a small police post in Bururu. From there, the story begins to darken. Witnesses would later describe how he was beaten to death and dumped in a river several kilometers away. Tonight, Murder Tapes returns to the evidence through witness testimony, investigative findings, and the words of the court that eventually reconstructed what happened in those final hours. This is not simply the story of a young man who died, it's one about power in the wrong hands, the fragility of justice in rural Kenya. And to date, no one can say why Dennis Lusava was killed. Now, what you're about to see is drawn from testimony, from medical reports, from the quiet language of a court judgment that tried in its careful way to make sense of a death that should never have happened. I am Brian Obuya. This is not just another crime story on a television screen near you. This is Murder Tapes, where the truth is buried in the evidence. The day they killed him. And so, it begins. Dennis Lusava was not a man known to headlines. He grew up far from courtrooms and the queues at the chief's offices in the quiet rural that shaped so many Kenyan lives. His parents had moved from the crowded hills of Vihiga County to the open settlement schemes of Matunda in Lugari. They were chasing land, some sort of stability, and the small dignity that comes with building something of your own. It was another chilly morning in Bururu. The kind of morning that settles gently over the settlement schemes of Lugari before the sun can fully claim the sky. Most people here are farmers. Maize, beans, the slow patience of the soil. But along the dusty, marram road that cuts through the center of the trading center, border riders gather early, leaning on their motorcycles, hoping the day will offer enough passengers to keep the engines running and the fuel tanks from running dry. On the dusty road that winds toward Mbururu, an old post office box stands in quiet surrender. Its rusted edges telling stories no one stops to read anymore. Nearby, the skeletal remains of abandoned government offices sits heavy with neglect. Walls once meant to serve, now crumbling into rubble. A slow, visible waste of promise and public trust. Time has not been kind here, but it has been honest. And yet, just beyond that decay, the rhythm of hammers and fresh construction begins to rise as new affordable housing takes shape from the same ground. It is a strange kind of contrast, ruin and renewal sharing the same breath. A reminder that even in places forgotten by systems and scarred by time, there is still the stubborn possibility that something better might stand again. But that possibility does not include the return of Dennis Lusava. And on that morning of October 7th, 2020, in a modest home not far from that road, Dennis Lusava was sitting down to breakfast with his mother. It was an ordinary moment that was quiet, domestic, and unremarkable in every possible way. His mother, Agnes Shikonjela Ambale, would later remember the morning with painful clarity.
Ilikuwa ni mwezi wa saba, mwezi wa 10, 2020, tarehe 7, ambao Dennis Lusaba aliamuka na akapata tumeandaa chai na tukakunywa. Wakati tulikunywa, rafiki yake alikuja kumtembelea, wakaondoka wakaenda soko. Walipoenda kwa soko, tulikaa. Wakakuja wakaniambia, kijana yako wameshika kwa police post hapo, police station hapo, na wako wanamchapa. Sasa vile walikuja kuniambia, mimi nikaona ni kawaida, huwa wanawashika na baadaye wawachilia. Nikaendelea tukakaa. Kafika mwendo wa saa 6. Mwingine tena akakuja akaniita. Kaniambia ndaona mtoto wako kwa police station wanachapa. Kweli nilikuwa na dada yangu hapa ambaye alikuwa anaitwa Roda. Tukaondoka tukaenda mpaka police station hapo. Tulipoingia pale tukapata hao maafisa wawili wa polisi ambao walikuwa wanaitwa Moa na Shirengo. Tukakuta amefungwa kwa dirisha, mikono yote wamemfungia kwa dirisha, na wamemtoa manguo, amepaki na hiyo shoti alikuwa nayo.
So for some context, police conduct in many rural parts of Kenya remains a troubling reality, shaped not only by the actions of officers, but also by the vulnerabilities of the communities they serve. In places like Mbururu, far from the scrutiny that often accompany policing in larger towns, authority can move with far less resistance. For many residents, interactions with the police are approached with caution, even resignation. Limited access to legal knowledge and long-standing power imbalances mean that people often struggle to recognize when the line between lawful arrest and unlawful abuse has been crossed. And on that afternoon at the police post, neither Rhoda or Dennis Lusava's mother initially questioned what they were seeing. To them, the uniform itself carried authority. If the officers said Dennis would be released upon payment of 2,000 shillings, or if they beat him while claiming to discipline him, it was difficult in that moment to challenge the legitimacy of those actions.
We conducted a baseline survey about the state of policing in Kenya, I think between 2022 and 2024. And one of the highest, 62% of the police violations or police abuse of power is extortion and bribery. So I think Kenyans have accepted this as a norm, that if a police officer arrests you and they're asking you for some small amount of money, you will give so that you can secure your freedom. People are happy not to go through cases. Maybe they don't want long court cases, because they know these cases can take time. They waste your time. Maybe you are innocent, and they feel like maybe the little bribe I'm being asked for to secure my freedom is a small price to pay, as opposed to being punished by being dragged through the criminal justice system. It's unfortunate. And I think that is why the parents were willing to pay that money.
That form of silence that is born from fear, from uncertainty, and from lack of awareness of rights is precisely what allows abuses to persist, especially in rural Kenya. In environments where accountability is distant and communities feel powerless to question authority, extrajudicial conduct can quietly take root, particularly among officers operating far from metropolitan oversight. And too often, it is only after tragedy unfolds that the full weight of those actions is brought into light. Now, back at the station, Dennis Lusava's mother and aunt requested to bring him food.
Dadangu akaenda akalete chapati na maharagwe. Alipolete chapati na maharagwe, wakamfungua hiyo mbingu. Akakuja hapo nje. Alipokuja hapo nje, hii vidole yote walikuwa wamechapa kila mahali. Hata kusimama ilikuwa ni shida. Walipoleta hiyo chakula tukampatia, hiyo mikono ikuweza kushika ile chakula. Taka hapo kanituma, kaniambia enda utafute shilingi 2,000. Karudi huko nyumbani, nikatafuta, sikupata. Nikarudi huko.
Nani alikwambia hapa?
Moa, huyo askari mwenye alikuwa anaitwa Moa, tulikuwa tumezoea kumuita Moa. Niliporudi huko, nikakuta wamemrudisha ndani. Akaniambia rudi nyumbani enda lete manguo ya ukijana. Kweli nilirudi hapa nyumbani na nikachukua long ambayo ilikuwa ya jeans na t-shirt nikapeleka. Nilipopeleka nikaingia ndani. Nilipoingia ndani nikataka kumfalisha ile longo. Wakaniambia nitoke nje ili najifanya afai mwenyewe nini longo. Nikatoka nje. Tukakaa hapo, tukakaa. Ikafika mwendo wa kama saa 11 hivi jioni, saa hatukukuwa na simu. Ilikuwa majioni. Wakarudi akatuma shangazi yangu, naitwa Saloma, aenda lete jacket. Sikuenda, wakamwambia enda ita mama mtoto mwenye afanye nini hakuje. Nikaenda, nikurudi huko, nikakuta wamesimama hapo. Tukafika hapo, tukakaa. Ule mtoto hapo ndani alianguka chini na kufanya tu na mpini ilikuwa hapo nje kwa police station, ambao huyo askari mmoja anaitwa Shirengo alichukua na akaingia ndani. Wakati alimchapa hatukusikia sauti ingine. Wakatuambia tutoke hapo. Tukatoka tukarudi. Nikakaa tena tukarudi karibu saa 1. Tukakuta wamefunga madirisha yote, wameweka pasia na wamefunga na wamesimama kwa gate. Wakatuambia hakuna kuingia hapa, kijana tumemwachilia. Walikuwa tu askari wawili, Shirengo na Moa. Sasa tulipofika hapo wakatuambia wamewachilia kijana. Tuende tumtafute kwa vituo ya pombe ama tuende Matunda.
Dennis Lusava was already dead. Inside the small confines of the police post, the realization did not arrive with ceremony or announcement. It crept in slowly, the way dread does. There was the heavy understanding that something irreversible had just happened. Panic began to move through the station, and the only and most immediate question would be, what did Lusava do? At the time of the prosecution, Nyaga was the victim's counsel, working under instructions from the International Justice Mission. What had started hours earlier as a routine display of authority and the daylight blatant collection of bribes had now crossed into something far darker. The young man who had been brought in alive, handcuffed, beaten, humiliated, was no longer breathing. And the officers present understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, the gravity of what lay before them. There had been a death in custody, and worse still, it was a death that could not be easily explained away. There had been no gunfire, no confrontation with armed suspects, no chaotic exchange that could later be dressed up as self-defense. There lay a battered body and a small police post that now becomes the last place where Dennis Lusava had been seen alive.
I think, unfortunately, what happened is they did not anticipate he would die. And as we see in many instances where somebody is in custody, but as a result of assault or injuries they suffer from the police, they die. It's an unfortunate thing. I don't think the police planned on it, so it caught them unawares.
In that moment, the officers knew something else as well. The very institution whose uniform they wore, the same system that often shielded its own, would struggle to defend them if the truth emerged. Because this was not the kind of death that could be folded neatly into an operational report. It looked too much like what it was, a killing.
Unlike many other police violations, this matter was investigated by the DCI. The Director of Criminal Investigation are the ones who investigated the matter. And they were able to unravel the entire cover-up. They were able to unravel all that evidence, forensic evidence, that he was in that police cell, that it was cleaned, that they tore the pages where they had booked him in the OB, in the occurrence book, and they called a cobbler to come and stitch it back after they tore the pages where they had recorded the custody of Dennis.
Dennis Lusava had already been released. The officers repeatedly claimed they had closed down the station. No one could get in. But the story did not make sense. No one had seen him leave the police post. No one had watched him walk back through the trading center.
Nikaitako watu wa bodaboda hapo, nikawaelezea. Huyu kijana walimshika asubuhi na inaonekana wametufukuza hapo, wanasema wamemwachilia na hajafika nyumbani. Hawa watu wa bodaboda akatuambia tuende kwa assistant chief. Tukaenda hiyo usiku tukafika hapo. Tulipofika kwa assistant chief nikamuelezea. Akaniambia yeye anipatie namba, akatupatia namba, tukapigia OCS Matunda. Tulipopigia OCS Matunda, akasema atakuja kesho. Sisi tukarudi nyumbani, tukaangalia mtoto hatukumpata. Ikafika asubuhi tena, tukaangalia mpaka masakari walikuwa wamefuna mahindi, hatukumpata. Tukachukua jukumu ya kwenda Matunda. Tukafika Matunda, tukakuta ofisa mwenye alikuwa on duty, alikuwa mama. Akatuuliza shideni ni gani? Kamwelezea kuna kijana wetu alishikwa jana na hajapatikana mpaka saa hii. Ya wanatuambia walimwachilia, lakini hajafika nyumbani. Wakatuuliza anaitwa nani? Tukamwambia anaitwa Dennis Lusava, lakini nickname walikuwa wanamuita Mukali. Sasa afisa akaangalia ndani, akakuta hiyo majina ya Dennis Lusava hakuna. Akatuambia tungoje. Tukangoja kidogo, akafungua sele, tukaingia ndani. Tukaangalia ndani, hatukumpata. Ilikuwa siku ya Alhamisi. Tukachukua jukumu ya kurudi, akatuambia huyu afisa akatuambia rudini, muende mwambie maaskari wawapatie nini mtoto, kwa sababu alikuwa kwa mikono yao, hapa hayuko. Sisi kurudi, tukakuta watu wamesajanika wengi, vikundi.
And the community did not take it lightly.
Isikia maneno tukasikia sasa barabara ifungiki. Ipitiki, yani bidii jeshi iliingia pande. Nikaamua kulala huko juu, tukafika pande asubuhi.
In places like Mbororo, people are used to carrying their own burdens. Disputes are settled within families. Misunderstandings are handled quietly between neighbors. Life here has always required a certain resilience. The understanding that many problems must be faced without the expectation of outside help. But this was different. A young man had been taken by the police and had not returned. In the eyes of the villagers, this was no longer a private matter or an ordinary dispute. It was something far more serious, a disappearance that cut directly into the fragile trust between the community and those deployed to protect it, like Moha and Sirengo. And that kind of violation does not pass quietly. It demanded attention. It demanded some answers of sorts. And as the hours passed without ether, anger began to rise. Deep, collective, and impossible to ignore.
Muda si muda, OCS akafika. Alipofika akachukua watu kadhaa hapo, tukaingia kwa hiyo ofisi yao. Sasa hao maaskari hao wakapaki nje. Alichukua watu hapo, sasa tukaanza kuongea, kila mtu akiongea yake. OCS kuna kijana alikuwa anaitwa Edika. Akainua mkono. Kamwambia OCS, kama hujamaliza kuongea, niko na picha ambao kijana ama askari vile walikuwa na mfuruta, tulichat, walipika picha.
It was a video.
Alipoangalia akasema hii imemaliza kila kitu. Wakati tulikuwa tumekaa hapo ndani, tulikuwa tujamaliza, OCS hajamaliza kuongea na watu, mawe wakaanza kurusha ndani.
Ulikuwa ndani hapo?
Tulikuwa ndani kwa police station hapo. Sasa OCS alipoona akakatisha mkutano. Sisi tukarudi nyumbani. Tukakaa. Nilikaa tu mahali tumekaa hapa. Muda wakasema wamechoma police station. Sisi tuko hapa tu. Mimi na dada yangu na huyu mtoto na mwingine ameenda shule kwa marehemu. Kwa tumekaa tu wakasema wanachoma police station. Tukakaa tukaona watu wanapita hapa wakituangalia. Sasa nikashindwa ni nini mbaya.
At the time of the fracas, Lusava's father, Stephen Indesha Malongo, was in Kisumu, only to receive the shattering news from his wife.
Pote wama kapilani simu, najua nini, kamanda chingia chochote. Jana alishikwa, alitoka polisi hapo, kumetafuta, sikupata yeye. Merudi jaka la miso, sikupata yeye. Paka mimi nikasikia mimi kakanywa juu na chini ya kuja pande hii, kupika pande hii. Isikiwe maneno tukasikia sasa barabara ifungiki, ipitiki, yani bidi ya jeshi liingie pande hii. Nikaamua kulala huko juu, kafika pande ya asubuhi. Basi kupika pande ya asubuhi, yebu kutembea, kuudiza, hapana. Kaenda baka mtu mwingine huko chini, hakuna mtoto. Kaenda mtu mwingine huko, hiyo mtoni inazunguka hivi. Kutoka hiyo mtoni kasema kama ni mtoni, kana ingekuwa angekwama kwa hii mizizi hii. Basi kutoka sikupata habari yote, hasa nilikuwa nikakaa hapo. Nikaenda baka kamocha ni Itale ili njia kutafuta, ingawa mama piga kwa polisi hakumpata. Mimi acha jaribu kamocha kama wengine wanasema enda angalia kamocha ali. Gafika Kitale kamocha. Kika huko. Kaangalia miili huko, sikumpata.
Tulipoangalia tukaona hatumpati, na kesho yake vile tulienda hapo tulipata damu iko kwa police station. Damu ilikuwa mahali pale. Sasa sisi tukashuku mtoto ni kama waliua, na hatujui mahali walipeleka.
For 5 days, there was no answer until October 12th, when the two distraught parents walked into a mortuary in Webuye, and inside, among the quiet steel drawers and the heavy smell of preservative chemicals, he made the sad identification.
Nasika wampiga mimi simu, hapana, siku mwili nyingine wamesema iko Webuye, kama unaweza kuja pene tuone. Kweli ukafika baka Matonda hapo, kakaa, kasema sasa weko na pesa ngapi? Kabla maditisa pani, nini hakuna pesa hapa. Kweli ukachukua pikipiki zilikuwa ngapi? 3. Moja ibeba mimi na huyu, nyingine kabeba hiyo malutisa na wawili. Kaenda kufika Webuye kamochari, ukaingia ndani. Kuingia ndani, Mtu mmoja akasema iko mwili umekuja hapa lakini iletwa na Land Cruiser. Na hiyo mwili ilikuwa itolewa kwa maji. Kama ni huyo mwendo uone. Kweli mimi niingia kwa hiyo mochari Webuye kuangalia tu namna hii. Nikamwambia ndio huyu. Hata sikuenda ati ABCD nione watatu. Yeye alifunga tu namna hii. Mwili iko tu hapo tu namna hii. Kasema pote ndio huyu. Huyo mtu mmoja akanifukuza ndani. Kaambia pana toka. Katoka tu kwa WhatsApp nikaenda nje. Akaniita mzee kuja nikarudi. Hebu angalia kwa hiyo mwili gani unasema kijana yako? Nikaponi ni huyu. Kama tena akanifukuta mara pili tena.
And there, on a cold slab, lay the young man who had stepped outside his home just days earlier after finishing breakfast. What began as a simple arrest in a quiet village would spiral into a chain of events that no amount of explanation could contain. But what really happened inside those walls? What evidence did investigators recover? And how did it piece together a story that some had hoped would never be told? When we return, we break down the forensic trail, the vehicle, the blood, and the river that refused to stay silent with that story. So stay with us. This is Murder Tips, the day they killed him. Crime scene images reviewed by Murder Tips capture the grim moment Dennis Lusava's body was pulled from the waters of River Nzoia. The river had already begun its quiet work. Lusava's skin showed signs of slippage, the unmistakable mark of a body that had spent time submerged, carried and turned around by the current. He appeared to have been bound, his hands drawn together toward his legs, restrained in a way that spoke of death and intent. The current was meant to carry him away, to ensure he would not be found. But the river did not keep that secret.
Kufika kwa Webuye ilikuwa inabaki tu kitu kidogo, Mungu tu. Kama hapo iko maji inaenda pande hii, nyingine inaenda pande hii. Kama ingeingia pande nyingine, hapo hiyo mnusa ikipatikana. Wanyama ni gawana hii.
Dennis Lusava had not been released. He had been delivered to the silence of a mortuary instead. But how?
Asa vile amefika Webuye hata mimi sijui. Na maana alikufia hapa, vile alifika Webuye sijui vile alikuwa Webuye. Kuliitiwa tu kutoka maji ni kutoka tu hapa na ile mwene mpaka Webuye.
It is the answer to that question and many more that the DCI led by Chief Inspector Peter Kamau had exhaustively answered before the Reuben Nyakundi court in Eldoret. The DCI at the time, under the DCI Director George Kinoti, appeared determined to leave nothing to chance. A lineup of expert witnesses took the stand before Justice Reuben Nyakundi. Together, their testimonies were meant to build a tight technical case, one designed to firmly anchor responsibility on Emmanuel Wafula alias Moha and Godwin Wekesa Sirengo. But let's go back to the most crucial part, the context. So, what really caused the dreaded beating of Dennis Lusava to death?
He was a victim of police brutality. Dennis was arrested by police officers on allegations of assault, that he had assaulted somebody. And in police custody, he was beaten, tortured, and killed.
The full narrative will later unfold in court that 3 days before his death, there had already been trouble. On October 4th, 2020, I see it was on a Sunday, Police Constable Reuben Yator, attached to Mbururu Police Post, was on a routine patrol with a fellow officer, Godwin Sirengo, the second accused person, The two moved through the busy marketplace, weaving past traders and customers until a disturbance pulled their attention toward a butchery. A man was shouting. He was aggressive and defiant. That man, the court would later hear, was the deceased, Dennis Lusava. What began as an attempt to calm the situation quickly spiraled. Words between police officers and Lusava had turned into threats. According to Police Constable Ruben Yator, the man declared that he would kill police officers and burn down Bururu police post. Well, he was drunk anyway. Then, violence erupted. In the chaos, Dennis Lusava reportedly beat police officer Ruben Yator's finger, leaving it injured, and dislocated his middle finger too. The officers tried to subdue him, but the situation slipped from their control. A crowd gathered restless, charged, and soon the marketplace turned hostile. The arrest never happened.
When they arrested Dennis, they were beating him up with electric cables and sticks. And even in custody, they beat him up and they cuffed him one hand on one of the windows inside the police cells.
Blocked by a growing rowdy crowd, the officers were forced to retreat. And on his part, injured, Police Constable Yator made his way to Matunda Sub-County Hospital where he was treated. His injuries were documented in a P3 form, later produced in court as evidence. On Wednesday, October 7th, 3 days later, Yator said he left the station. He would not be there when the man he had fought in the marketplace was finally arrested. And by the time he returned, that man, Dennis Lusava, would be dead. It is that part of the story that the family had no idea about, and the court appeared to take little interest in it, especially because Lusava had already been arrested and subdued. Killing him was an invitation for the court to decide their fate. Following the killing, police had to do so much more to convince the locals that Lusava was not in their police post.
Tukatoka tukarudi, nikakaa tena tukarudi karibu saa moja, tukakuta wamefunga madirisha yote, wameweka pasia na wamefunga na wamesimama kwa gate. Wakatuambia hakuna kuingia hapa, kijana tumemwachilia. Walikuwa tu askari wawili, Shirengo na Moa. Sasa tulipofika hapo, wakatuambia wamewachilia kijana. Tuenda tumtafute kwa vituo ya pombe ama kwenda Matunda.
On that very night of October 7th, 2020, Ruben Obadia Ongai received what sounded like an urgent human call, a plea from a longtime friend. Police officer Emmanuel Wafula told him a colleague's wife was in labor and needed to be rushed to hospital. Without hesitation, Ruben handed over his car, KBH 939J, taking in exchange Wafula's motorcycle, a gesture of trust between men who knew each other well. The vehicle left at around 8 p.m. and returned hours later at 3 a.m. Its journey was not explained, and the urgency was no longer questioned. It would only be later, when investigators came knocking, that the same car would be impounded as part of a murder investigation, dragging Ruben into a story far darker than the one he had been told by Emmanuel. It was dawning on him, and now you, that in cases like this, even acts of goodwill can unknowingly become entangled in the machinery of crime.
The fact that, so they had to, unfortunately, they had to to fuel the car. They hired a car from somebody. They fueled the car. They used a motorbike. And all of this left a trail of forensic evidence.
I hope you remember the doctrine of last seen, which we discussed in our previous episode on Mary Wangoi, an episode that we titled Final Night Out.
It is a product of what we call circumstantial evidence, where a person of interest or an accused person is a person who was last seen with the deceased, a victim of a murder or a victim of a killing. And what happened is that now after corroborative evidence has been proffered, the accused is now invited to explain his whereabouts and the whereabouts of the victim. If he's unable to provide a reasonable explanation to discharge the guilty presumption that he might have been involved in the murder of the victim, then he's deemed to be guilty. There are several elements. First, there has to be cogent evidence that points fingers towards the victim being last seen with this person. And then there is no further explanation on the whereabouts of the deceased up until either when the body is discovered or either there is nothing to explain away what happened after that. So it is only that information of what happened after the meeting, after this person being last seen with the deceased, is information only peculiarly and exclusively at the possession of the accused.
With that said, that the two police officers were the last people to be seen with Lusava was not the only circumstantial evidence leading the probe. In a case where witnesses wavered and timelines blurred, investigators turned to something far less emotional: data. At the center of that trail was Corporal Jonathan Limo, a liaison officer at Safaricom, the man tasked with translating human movement into digital footprints. He told the court sitting at Eldoret that a formal request had come in from the DCI, a demand for call data records and subscriber details that were linked to specific numbers believed to be in the hands of Emmanuel and Godwin. What he retrieved would become part of the prosecution's technical backbone, produced in court as Exhibit 14 and 15. Now, according to that data, on the night of October 7th, 2020, the night that Lusava vanished, both police officers went silent and off radar. The first accused person, Emmanuel Wafula, aka Moha, was using a mobile phone number 0703 ending in 059. At exactly 9:23 p.m. that night, that phone's signal went dead. His phone was switched off. It was last traced to Ndalu in Moy's Bridge. It would remain off until the following morning at 7:17 a.m. By the following morning, I mean October 8th, when it suddenly came back to life. But that wasn't all. The court heard that the police officer, that is Emmanuel, had another line, which was his primary line. That line remained active. Through that line, he was able to communicate with a prosecution witness on the same night his other phone had gone dark. Then there was accused number 2, Godwin Wekesa Sirengo. He, too, had a phone. He was using a 0729 ending in 905. And just like Emmanuel's second line, it also went off. Same night, same time, 9:23 p.m. Same location, Ndalu, in Moy's Bridge. These were two different men, two different phones, and one identical moment of silence and off radar. The only different thing was that Godwin's phone would only come back on the next day at 10:24 a.m. That is 2 hours after our fullers. He must have overslept. To the men investigating the murder and the connection of the two police officers, two accused persons switching off their phones at the same place at the same time on the same night a man disappears was not coincidence. For the investigating officer, no eyewitness needed to say it. The data was already speaking to it. In short, the court in Eldoret was satisfied that the evidence tendered by the prosecution was enough to convict the two police officers should they choose to remain silent even during the rest of the trial. Emmanuel and Sirengo denied any involvement in the murder of Dennis Lusava. Their defense followed a consistent line, a line that Dennis had previously been involved in an altercation with police officer Ruben Yator. He was lawfully arrested on 7th October 2020 as a suspect in that assault. That he was briefly held in custody at Bururu Police Post. That he was then released on instructions of a senior police officer, Corporal Uhuru. After his release, they claimed to have no knowledge of his whereabouts. Emmanuel added that he was on leave at the time and denied tampering with the occurrence book or being linked to any forensic evidence. Sirengo maintained that he was only assisting with general duties and similarly distanced himself from any assault or killing of Lusava. The defense called 3 civilian witnesses to support the claim that Dennis was alive and free after leaving police custody. The first was Jane Rose Nekesa. She testified that she accompanied Dennis' mother to the police station and that during that visit, Dennis himself reportedly explained that he had been arrested because he had fought with a police officer. Crucially, she stated that she did not observe any unusual condition or injuries on Dennis. Now, the defense implication of that testimony was to draw the court to believe that Dennis appeared normal and unharmed while at the station. Then there was Nelson Lucas. Lucas told the court sitting in Eldoret that on the 7th of October 2020, when he was at home making funeral arrangements, Dennis passed by his home. Dennis told Lucas that he had disagreed with the police, he had been arrested, and that he had now been released. The implication would be Dennis was alive and moving freely after the alleged release. Andrew Mwenyi also testified that on the same day, Dennis visited them during those funeral preparations. Dennis similarly explained he had been arrested after dispute with police but had been released. This defense was meant to reinforce the narrative that Dennis left custody alive.
Anatoka mbali sana. Unaona ukiwa hapa ng'ambo ile sasa atapita atawachiliwache kwa compound yao ya hapa na alafu apite kwa compound yao. Wanatoka hao sasa wako Trans Nzoia huku na huku sasa tumeita Kakamega County. Hao wanatoka mbali kule ng'ambo. Na tena hao walienda kotini sikuwapata kwa station wakati tukienda. Mtu yote hakukuwa hapo. Alikuwa tu kijana wangu na maaskari wawili.
Now, Murder Tapes has analyzed the case of the Republic versus Emmanuel and Godwin and made the following analysis. The overall defense was built on a post-release narrative, anchored on lawful arrest based on an earlier assault incident, release under orders from a superior officer, and civilian sightings of Dennis alive after leaving police custody. From this, the argument would then change to mean the two accused persons had no further control or contact with Dennis after he was released. They had no control of any subsequent events leading to his death that occurred outside police custody, and that there was no direct evidence placing them at the scene of death.
I will share this with you, this decision. So I want to go there and share before you leave.
The civilian witnesses on their part were central to the defense. Their role was to introduce reasonable doubt, to break the chain between custody and death, and suggest that Lusava's death may have occurred after he left the police post. The court would then examine the defense carefully, line by line, witness by witness, claim by claim. The accused insisted Dennis had been released, but the Reuben Nyakundi court asked a simple question: where is the record of his release? But there was no formal entry and no independent confirmation or a trail of movement after custody, apart from the words of Emmanuel, Sirengo, Jane, and Lucas.
The aggravating factors in this matter outweigh any metrics of mitigation.
Then came the civilian witnesses, which the defense relied on to break the chain and show that Dennis walked free. The timing, the consistency, and probability would be displaced by court. Their accounts, though similar, could not stand against the weight of other evidence. Because outside the courtroom stories, there were facts, and these facts were hard facts.
Was his death avoidable? The answer is yes. Death is avoidable unless by the act of God. Any death which occurs in the midst, unless the one by the act of God, this is my strong belief that death is avoidable. Particularly, this was avoidable death. It did not have to occur and prematurely terminate the right to life.
In the end, the defense collapsed, with the two former police officers being sent away for 35 years in prison for the torture, the murder, and concealing the body of their victim.
Our brothers had all what it takes to secure the life of the deceased in this matter. But unfortunately, that was never to be, and then we found ourselves in this litigation under the criminal justice system. All in all, I sentenced each accused person to 35 years imprisonment, and they have 14 days right of appeal to the Court of Appeal. They can then test this decision and be able to see whether we exercised our discretion using the legal lens and using the materials and using the principles of the Constitution in arriving at this decision.
For the Lusava family, grief has settled into the spaces that Dennis once occupied. Maybe doing so silently, but persistently, in the small reminders that return without warning.
Tukashukuru Mungu, mahali tulikuwa na uchungu tukatulia.
Kwa mambo mengi alikuwa tu kijana tu, yani kwa kufanya kazi ya bodaboda, kipata yako mbili zachukua hii, kipata yako kidogo, mama yangu tuko kwa hilo nileta. Tupata kidogo sana, nasema mtoto aende kwa hii nimpe mtoto aende kwa shule. Mimi kitabu namlea maisha tu namleta. Kama ikuja kacha ni watoto ni wawili. Watoto wawili. Mmoja bado yuko shule sasa hii, hajakuja. Na mwingine ndio huyu unaona anakala tito na chochote yake huyu. Meyuka katikati.
They have since flattened his final resting place, as though leveling the ground might soften the memory, as though erasing the shape of his grave could quiet the violence and impunity that marked his final hours. But even that cannot strip away the weight of what was done. the cruel theater of power, the false authority, the men who wore the law and broke it, and in doing so, took their son's life. Where the police post once stood, there is now only ruin. A hollow reminder of a place that failed when it was needed most. In its place, a church has risen, its walls reaching upward in quiet defiance, as if faith itself might cleanse what happened there. But for the people of Mbururu, no structure, however sacred, can fully erase that day. It lingers on. Dennis Lusava died in custody in a place where the law promises us safety. In the hands of men sworn to protect life, he was beaten, restrained, and removed from the very system that should have delivered him to court. And when it was over, when his body no longer moved and the consequences became impossible to ignore, they chose concealment over truth. Murder Tips finds that this case forces a difficult question. Not about really what happened, because the court has already answered that, but about how easily it happened. What does it then say about a system when a man can enter a police post alive and leave it as a body? Anyway, this story did not just end. The trail was followed, the evidence was gathered, the inconsistencies were challenged, and the truth was reconstructed piece by piece. For that, credit must be given to the officers of the Directorate of Criminal Investigations who stepped into a case that began in confusion and anger and pursued it with the responsibility that it demanded. Justice in this case did not arrive quickly, but somehow it arrived. And even then, it comes with a reminder that justice after the fact is not the same as protection before it. Dennis Lusava should have had his day in court. Instead, his story became the evidence. And if this case teaches us anything at all, it is that the law must not only punish those who break it, it must protect those placed in its care. This has been Murder Tips, the day they killed him. Thanks for watching. Good evening.